Maria Hernandez was a strong, resilient woman who raised her two sons, Daniel and Luis, all by herself. Their father had walked out on them when the boys were still very young, leaving Maria to shoulder all the responsibilities of raising a family on her own. Despite the hardships, she worked tirelessly to provide for her sons, often taking on multiple jobs just to make ends meet. She would wake up before the sun rose to clean offices, spend her afternoons as a waitress at a local diner, and even took up sewing clothes late into the night. Her hands became rough, her eyes tired, but she never complained. For Maria, every moment of struggle was worth it, knowing it would give her sons a chance at a better life. As the years passed, Maria's efforts began to bear fruit. Luis, her youngest, grew up to be a kind, compassionate young man who adored his mother. He was always there to help her, whether it was carrying groceries, cooking dinner, or simply sitting with her to talk about her day. Luis seemed to understand, even from a young age, how much Maria had sacrificed for them. He made a conscious effort to repay her kindness, to be the son who would make all her hard work feel worthwhile. Daniel, on the other hand, was different. He was ambitious, always looking for the next big thing, and he had dreams that extended far beyond their small neighborhood. From an early age, Daniel was determined to escape the life of poverty that he felt trapped in. He excelled in school, not out of a love for learning, but because he saw it as a means to an end. He was always planning his next move, focused on building a future for himself that would take him far away from the struggles that his family faced. While Maria admired her eldest son's drive, she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness every time he distanced himself a little more. He rarely spent time at home, always choosing to hang out with friends or stay late at school to study. When Daniel left for college, it was the final blow. He won a scholarship to a prestigious university in another state, and though Maria was incredibly proud of him, it broke her heart that he never looked back. The phone calls became infrequent, and the visits almost non-existent. Every time Maria called him, there was always an excuse. He was too busy, had a project to finish or a meeting to attend, and with every unanswered call, Maria's heart grew heavier. Luis watched as their mother grew older, her once vibrant spirit dimming with every passing year. He could see the pain in her eyes whenever she talked about Daniel, the way her voice would falter when she'd mention how she hadn't heard from him in months. And so, Luis stepped in, determined to be the son who would never leave her side. He turned down opportunities to move away, took on local jobs, and made sure Maria was never alone. It wasn't a sacrifice for him. It was simply what love demanded. Then one fateful night, Maria collapsed. Luis found her on the kitchen floor, unconscious, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through him as he called for an ambulance, his heart pounding in his chest. At the hospital, the doctors informed him that Maria had suffered a stroke. They managed to stabilize her, but the damage was done. She would need constant care, therapy, and medication to maintain her health. Luis didn't hesitate. He quit his job, moved back into the family home, and devoted himself to looking after his mother. He became her caregiver, her companion, and her strength. It wasn't easy. There were days when he felt overwhelmed, exhausted, and hopeless. But every time he looked at Maria, lying there so fragile, he remembered all the sacrifices she had made for him and his brother. And that kept him going. One evening, as he sat by her bedside, Maria took his hand in hers. Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but her eyes were bright, shining with a clarity that Luis hadn't seen in a long time. "Promise me, Luis," she said. "Promise me you'll look after Daniel when I'm gone." Luis felt a lump form in his throat, and he swallowed hard, nodding. He didn't understand why his mother still worried about Daniel, why she still cared after all the years of neglect, but he respected her wish. "I promise, Mama," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I'll take care of him." Maria's health continued to decline, and despite Luis's best efforts, there was only so much he could do. One cold winter morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the window, Maria took her last breath. Luis was by her side, holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. The house felt emptier than ever, and for the first time, Luis felt truly alone. He buried Maria in the family plot, and in those moments of profound grief, he looked around and realized that Daniel hadn't even shown up for the funeral. It didn't surprise him, but it hurt more than he was willing to admit. Weeks turned into months, and life slowly began to return to a sense of normalcy, or at least as normal as it could be without Maria. Then, out of nowhere, Daniel appeared on Luis's doorstep. He was unrecognizable, dressed in expensive clothes, sporting a watch that probably cost more than their mother's entire medical bill. He looked around the house with a detached gaze, as if the years he had spent away had erased all the memories of their childhood. "I heard about Mom," he said flatly. "I'm sorry I couldn't be there." Luis stared at him, anger bubbling up inside. "Why are you here now, Daniel?" he demanded. "Where were you when she needed you?" Daniel brushed off the question with a dismissive wave. "I was busy," he replied coolly. "I had my own life to deal with." Luis wanted to scream, to tell his brother how he had watched their mother's heart break every time Daniel ignored her calls, but he remembered his promise. So he kept his emotions in check, nodded, and let Daniel in. They sat down to discuss their mother's estate, and that's when Luis discovered that Maria had left everything to be split between them. Before Luis could even process the news, Daniel took control. He sold the house, emptied their mother's bank accounts, and liquidated every asset she had left behind. Luis watched in horror as his brother turned their mother's life's work into cash, treating it as nothing more than a windfall. It happened so quickly, as if Daniel had been waiting for this moment all along. Luis tried to reason with him, tried to remind him of the years their mother had spent building that wealth, but Daniel was deaf to his pleas. "It's just money, Luis," he scoffed. "What are you so worked up about?" He spent it as quickly as he got it, throwing extravagant parties, buying luxury cars, and flying off to exotic destinations. Luis couldn't believe how someone could be so careless, so heartless. It was as if their mother's memory meant nothing to him, as if everything she had worked for was just another thing to be consumed and discarded. Luis felt a deep, aching sadness settle in his chest. He had tried to keep his promise, to protect his brother, but Daniel was beyond saving. He watched from afar, feeling helpless as Daniel's life spiraled into a whirlwind of excess and recklessness. There was nothing he could do but hope that one day his brother would realize the true cost of his actions. And so, Luis went on with his life, trying to pick up the pieces of a family that had been shattered beyond repair. But no matter how much time passed, he could never forget the image of his mother lying in that hospital bed, asking him to care for a brother who had never cared for her. It was a promise that haunted him, one that he wasn't sure he could ever truly fulfill. Luis watched from a distance as Daniel's life spiraled out of control, feeling a mix of sadness, anger, and helplessness. It was as if Daniel had entered a frenzy, desperately trying to drown himself in a life of luxury and excess, to compensate for years of emotional emptiness. He moved into a high-rise penthouse, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city, and threw parties that lasted well into the morning. Every weekend, his place was filled with strangers who treated him like their best friend, as long as the drinks kept flowing and the music kept pounding. Luis could barely recognize his brother. It was as if Daniel had transformed into a completely different person, one who had no ties to the family that had raised him, no connection to the values their mother had instilled in them. Each time Luis tried to reach out, to talk some sense into him, Daniel brushed him off with a laugh or an indifferent shrug. "Why can't you just let me enjoy myself?" he'd say, his words slurred by alcohol. "We've earned this, Luis, I've earned this." Luis knew that Daniel wasn't living, he was running. He was running from the guilt, from the pain of abandoning their mother, and from the emptiness that came from trying to fill his life with meaningless things. Every time Luis confronted him, Daniel would make some grand gesture to show that he was in control, buying another sports car, planning an even more extravagant vacation, or treating his entourage to another round of drinks. It was all an illusion, a desperate attempt to convince himself that he was happy, that he hadn't made the biggest mistake of his life by turning his back on the one person who had loved him unconditionally. It wasn't long before the cracks in Daniel's lifestyle began to show. The lavish parties became less frequent as the money started to dwindle. One by one, the so-called friends who had surrounded him disappeared, moving on to the next person who could fund their lifestyle. Daniel didn't notice at first. He was too caught up in his own world, too busy spending every last dollar as if it would somehow bring him the happiness he was searching for. Then came the bills. The rent for his penthouse was overdue, the luxury car payments were piling up, and credit card companies started calling, demanding the money he didn't have. It hit Daniel like a ton of bricks, but instead of facing reality, he chose to ignore it. He borrowed more money, took out loans with outrageous interest rates, and even tried to sell off what little he had left of their mother's belongings. It was around this time that Luis decided to intervene. He went to Daniel's penthouse one evening, finding his brother sitting alone in the living room, surrounded by empty bottles and piles of unopened bills. For a moment, Luis just stood there, taking in the sight of the man who had once been so full of ambition and confidence, now reduced to a shadow of himself. He felt a deep sadness, not just for what Daniel had become, but for the fact that this could have been avoided if only Daniel had valued what truly mattered. "Daniel," Luis said softly, stepping into the room. "We need to talk." Daniel didn't even look up. "There's nothing to talk about," he muttered, his voice hoarse. "Everything's fine." Luis sighed, sitting down across from him. "No, it's not. Look at yourself. This isn't who you are." "What do you know about who I am?" Daniel snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. "You stayed behind, living in that tiny house with Mom while I went out and made something of myself." Luis shook his head. "You didn't make anything, Daniel. You've just been spending what Mom worked her whole life to build. You didn't earn any of this." Daniel jumped to his feet, knocking over an empty bottle that rolled across the floor. "Don't you dare lecture me," he shouted. "You have no idea what it's like to be me, to be expected to succeed, to be the one who was supposed to make something of himself." Luis stood as well, but his voice remained calm, steady. "You're right," he said. "I don't know what that's like. But I do know what it's like to watch our mother work herself to the bone just to give us a chance at a better life. I know what it's like to hold her hand as she took her last breath, knowing that she still loved you, even though you never came to see her." Those words seemed to hit Daniel harder than any punch. He staggered back, his face crumpling as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. "I didn't mean for it to be like this," he whispered, sinking into a chair. I wanted to forget." Luis sat down next to him. "I know, Daniel, but running away won't make it any better. You have to face what you've done. You have to accept that you made mistakes just like the rest of us." For a long time, they sat there in silence, the only sound the distant hum of the city below. Then, with a shaky breath, Daniel reached for one of the unopened bills and tore it open. He stared at the numbers, the reality of his situation finally sinking in. "I don't have anything left," he admitted. "It's all gone." Luis put a hand on his shoulder. "You still have me," he said quietly. "And I'm not going anywhere." And over the next few months, Daniel struggled to pick up the pieces of his life. He sold the penthouse, the cars, and everything else he had bought in his desperate attempt to escape reality. It wasn't enough to cover his debts, but Luis helped him negotiate with the creditors, finding ways to settle what he owed. It was a long, difficult process, one that forced Daniel to confront the consequences of his actions every single day. There were moments when he wanted to give up, to run away again, but each time he thought about it, he remembered his mother's face, the way she had smiled at him when he was a boy, so full of love and hope for his future. And he kept going. He moved in with Luis, who had managed to turn their mother's small savings into a modest but successful business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Daniel began to find solace in the routine, in the simple act of building something with his own hands. Slowly, he started to rebuild his life, this time with the knowledge that happiness couldn't be bought, that it came from the connections he had with the people who cared about him. Luis watched as his brother changed, the hard edges of his personality softening, the arrogance fading away. Daniel was still a work in progress, still haunted by the mistakes he had made, but for the first time in years, Luis saw glimpses of the brother he had once known. The one who had dreams, who had the potential to be someone great, not because of the money he had, but because of the heart that Maria had always believed he possessed. And although Daniel could never undo the damage he had caused, he found a way to honor their mother's memory, not by spending her inheritance, but by living a life that she would have been proud of. As the years passed, Daniel struggled to come to terms with everything he had lost. The weight of his actions lingered over him like a shadow, a constant reminder of the pain he had caused, not only to himself, but to the people who had loved him the most. Moving in with Luis had been a humbling experience. It meant swallowing his pride and admitting that he had failed his mother, his brother, and himself. But in the simplicity of this new life, Daniel began to rediscover parts of himself that had been buried for so long under layers of arrogance, resentment, and shame. Luis ran a small repair shop in their hometown, something he had started with the remnants of his share of their mother's inheritance. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, and it was enough to keep them both afloat. He hired Daniel to help out, starting him off with simple tasks, sweeping the floors, organizing the shelves, and handling the paperwork. For Daniel, who had once prided himself on being the most successful, the most ambitious, it was a difficult adjustment. There were days when he felt like he had taken 10 steps back, when he wanted to throw in the towel and walk away again. But every time he felt the urge to give up, he remembered the promise Luis had made to their mother, and it was that memory that kept him grounded. At first, the two brothers barely spoke. The silence between them was thick with all the words that had gone unsaid, all the years of resentment and misunderstanding. Luis didn't push Daniel to talk about what had happened, and Daniel wasn't ready to face it. But slowly, over time, they found themselves sharing bits and pieces of their lives. It started with small things. Daniel asking how to fix a leak in the roof, Luis sharing stories about their mother's favorite recipes. As they worked side by side, the tension between them began to ease, replaced by a sense of companionship that felt like it had been there all along, just waiting to be rediscovered. One evening, as they sat together in the small living room after a long day at the shop, Daniel finally broke down. It was as if all the emotions he had kept bottled up for so long came rushing out at once. Tears streamed down his face as he choked out an apology, his voice thick with guilt and regret. "I'm so sorry, Luis," he whispered, his shoulders shaking. "I'm sorry for everything, for not being there for Mom, for taking everything and throwing it away. I've ruined everything and I don't know how to fix it." Luis listened quietly, letting his brother pour out his heart. When Daniel was finished, Luis placed a hand on his shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "You can't change the past," he said softly. "None of us can. But you can choose what you do from here on out. It's not about what you've done, Daniel. It's about what you're willing to do now." It wasn't an easy road to redemption. There were setbacks, moments when Daniel felt like he was drowning in the mistakes he had made. But with Luis by his side, He learned how to pick himself up and keep moving forward. He began to understand that rebuilding his life wasn't about chasing after wealth or status. It was about finding a sense of purpose, something that went beyond material possessions. Daniel started volunteering at a local community center, the same one that their mother had once taken them to when they were children. It was a place that provided meals for the homeless, after-school programs for kids, and support for families who were struggling to make ends meet. At first, he felt out of place, awkward and uncomfortable. He wasn't sure how to connect with people who had been through so much, especially when he had spent so much of his life trying to avoid his own problems. But gradually, he began to see the impact he could make, the way a simple act of kindness could change someone's day, even their life. One afternoon, as he was serving food to a line of people waiting for a hot meal, he noticed an elderly woman standing off to the side, her eyes downcast, her shoulders hunched. There was something about her that reminded him of their mother, the way she held herself, the way she seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on her frail frame. Without thinking, Daniel walked over to her and offered her a seat, bringing her a warm plate of food. They sat together in silence for a while, and then she began to talk, sharing bits and pieces of her life, the struggles she had faced, and the family she had lost. As Daniel listened, he felt a lump form in his throat. It was as if he were hearing his mother's voice all over again, reminding him of the importance of compassion, of empathy, of the bonds that tie us all together. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't just helping this woman. He was healing himself. He was honoring his mother's memory, not by clinging to the wealth she had left behind, but by embodying the values she had lived by: kindness, generosity, and an unwavering love for others. As the months turned into years, Daniel found himself becoming more involved in the community. He took on more responsibilities at the center, organizing fundraisers, mentoring kids who were at risk of falling through the cracks, and even helping some of the families find stable housing. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was fulfilling. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was part of something bigger than himself. One day, as he was packing up at the end of a long shift, he found a letter tucked into his coat pocket. It was from one of the young boys he had been mentoring, a kid who had grown up in a broken home, much like he and Luis had. The letter was simple, just a few lines scrawled in messy handwriting, but it brought tears to Daniel's eyes. "Thank you for believing in me," it read. "You helped me see that I can be more than what people expect me to be." Daniel stood there for a long time, holding the letter in his hands, and in that moment, he felt a profound sense of peace. He had spent so many years chasing after things that didn't matter, convinced that money and success would make him happy, only to realize that true happiness came from making a difference in the lives of others. Back at home, Luis watched his brother with a sense of quiet pride. He had always known that Daniel had the potential to be so much more than the man he had become, and now he was finally living up to that potential. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had softened, replaced by a bond that was stronger than ever. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Daniel turned to Luis with a smile. "I never thanked you," he said, "for everything, for believing in me, even when I didn't deserve it." Luis shrugged, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're my brother," he said simply. "That's what family does." Daniel nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be. And though he knew he could never undo the mistakes he had made, he also knew that he had the rest of his life to make things right, to honor his mother's memory, to repay his brother's kindness, and to build a life that was worthy of the love he had been given. In the end, Daniel discovered that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, about taking the lessons and the pain and turning them into something beautiful, And as he stood there watching the last rays of sunlight fade into the sky, he felt a sense of gratitude that he had never known before. He had lost everything, but in the process, he had found himself. And that, he realized, was the greatest gift his mother could have ever given him.